Chris had always known his dog to be calm and well-behaved, rarely straying from the usual routine. But today, his dog was acting strange. The normally quiet pup was pacing nervously, circling around a bush in the distance as if something was amiss. Chris watched for a moment, confused before his curiosity got the best of him. He quickly walked over to where the dog had been focused, his curiosity piqued by the dog's unusual behavior. As he approached, Chris could see the dog sitting, its eyes fixed on a particular spot beneath the bush. It wasn't like his dog to act so erratically, and the sense that something was off grew stronger the closer he got. Chris pushed aside a few branches and peered into the thick underbrush, and that's when he saw it. Tucked away beneath the leaves was a tiny creature, shivering and almost completely hairless. Chris's heart skipped a beat as he knelt down to get a closer look. The small, fragile animal made a soft, squealing noise, its body twitching with a mixture of hunger and distress. It was unlike anything Chris had ever seen before. "What are you?" Chris muttered under his breath. The creature's skin was almost translucent, and its bald body looked delicate and vulnerable. He felt a wave of sympathy for the tiny thing, its eyes shut tight in darkness, seemingly unaware of its surroundings. The dog sat beside Chris, looking up at him with a worried expression as if urging him to help. The situation was odd, but the poor animal was clearly in need. Chris gently scooped up the tiny creature and cradled it in his hands. It squealed again, a pitiful sound that tugged at his heartstrings. Maybe her parents died, or maybe she was abandoned, Chris mused quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Whatever the case, he couldn't bear the thought of leaving the helpless animal behind to suffer. Without hesitation, he decided to take the creature home, hoping he could figure out what it needed. Once back at his house, Chris placed the small, pink creature on his kitchen counter. He examined it closely, still unable to identify it. "What are you?" he repeated, his confusion deepening. The creature resembled a baby rabbit, but something was definitely off. Its body was thin, its skin nearly bare, and its eyes remained tightly shut. It looked malnourished, weak, and utterly helpless. Chris stared at the little animal, frustration beginning to mount. He had no idea how to care for something like this. It was clear that it needed nourishment, but he didn't even know what to feed it. Without proper knowledge, Chris could do more harm than good. Determined to get answers, Chris reached for the phone and called his local veterinarian's office. After explaining the creature's appearance, a tiny, bald animal that seemed to be starving, the vet on the other end of the line sounded intrigued. "Could you bring it in? I'd like to take a look at it myself," the vet said, his voice calm but clearly curious about this unusual case. Relieved to have some professional guidance, Chris agreed and set off for the vet's office. The small creature sat quietly in the passenger seat, wrapped in a towel Chris had found, and Chris couldn't help but feel a growing sense of responsibility. He had no idea what was wrong with this animal, but he was determined to find out and help it however he could. When they arrived at the vet's office, Chris was greeted by the vet, who immediately took the creature from Chris's hands. The vet's eyes widened in surprise as he examined the animal closely, his hands gentle but experienced as he checked the tiny creature for any obvious signs of injury or illness. "It's not like anything I've seen before," the vet said, his brow furrowing as he examined it. "We'll need to run some tests to figure out what's going on, but I think it might be a baby mammal of some sort." Chris felt a sense of relief knowing that the vet was taking the situation seriously, but he couldn't shake the nagging worry in his chest. What if the creature couldn't survive? What if it was too far gone? The vet took a few samples and placed the tiny creature in an incubator to keep it warm and stable while they waited for results. Chris sat nervously in the waiting room, his mind racing with questions. What kind of animal was this? How had it ended up in the woods alone? And most importantly, what would happen to it? After what felt like hours, the vet returned to the waiting room, a concerned look on his face. "We've identified it," he said, sitting down across from Chris. "This little one is a baby marsupial, a species that's rarely found in this area. It seems to have gotten separated from its mother, possibly after the mother died or abandoned it. It's incredibly weak, but we're going to do everything we can to help it survive. Chris let out a sigh of relief, grateful that it wasn't as dire as he had feared. The vet explained that the creature would need special care, including warmth, food, and constant monitoring to give it the best chance of survival. Over the following weeks, Chris worked closely with the vet to care for the little marsupial. It required a special diet, frequent feeding, and a lot of patience. Chris named it Pip, after its tiny size and constant need for care. Slowly but surely, Pip started to grow stronger. The vet was optimistic that with enough time and attention, the little creature would be able to survive and possibly even be released back into the wild someday. Chris, though relieved, couldn't shake the thought of how fragile life was. He'd gone into the woods that day expecting to find something simple, a walk with his dog, and had stumbled upon a life that needed saving. The experience had taught him that even the smallest actions could make a world of difference. The vet worked swiftly, assessing the small creature Chris had brought in. A quick inspection confirmed Chris's suspicion. The infant was indeed hungry, and dehydration was likely a contributing factor. The vet immediately gave the animal fluids to rehydrate, followed by a liquid meal to provide some nourishment. As Chris watched the vet work, he could see the concern in the professional's eyes. After tending to the tiny creature, the vet turned to Chris, his expression thoughtful. "This doesn't seem like a rabbit," he muttered, running his fingers through his hair. "What do you mean?" Chris asked, perplexed. The vet rolled his chair over to his computer, scrolling through some images. He pointed at various pictures, comparing them to the creature in front of them. "This animal lacks some key features typically associated with rabbits," the vet explained. "It does have larger ears and 4 legs, but its anatomy is off. When I palpated its belly, some of its organs didn't seem quite right. It could be a different species entirely." Chris felt a pang of frustration at the lack of answers. "So, what is it then?" The vet sighed, shaking his head. "I'm not sure. It's possible that it's some type of orphaned or abandoned species, but I can't say for certain right now. We'll need to observe it more as it grows. Its features may become clearer." Despite the vet's uncertainty, he suggested that Chris take the animal home for a while. Let it recover and grow stronger, and we might get a better idea of what we're dealing with. Chris agreed, although he felt a lingering unease. What had he found in the woods? He returned home with the creature in tow, unsure of what the future held. As the days passed, the little animal, which Chris had begun to think of as the mysterious creature, began to settle in. It was eating well, and for the first time since he found it, it seemed calm and content. Chris even set up a bed for it in the old basket that his dog used, keeping it warm and comfortable. The creature's skin was still bald and its movements awkward, but it began to show signs of life. Its eyes twitched and it seemed to grow more curious. Chris couldn't help but marvel at how it had started to recover. Every time he checked in on it, it was more playful, exploring its new surroundings. But on the 3rd day, things took an unexpected turn. Chris woke up in the middle of the night, his heart racing for no apparent reason. He immediately checked his watch, 3:15 a.m. Something didn't feel right. He pushed off his covers and hurried downstairs, feeling an odd sense of urgency. At first glance, everything seemed fine. The creature was still in its basket, and the house was quiet. But as Chris made his way to the back door, his heart sank. The door was wide open. Confusion struck him. He was sure he had locked it before heading to bed, as he always did. He stood frozen for a moment, wondering if he had forgotten. But then, as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw something else. The metal trash cans in the corner of the yard had been tipped over. Chris sighed, trying to calm himself. "That must have been the noise I heard," he reasoned, taking a deep breath. He walked over to the cans, which were now lying on their sides, their lids scattered across the grass. Upon closer inspection, he saw that the bags inside the cans were torn open. Garbage was strewn across the patio, and the smell of discarded food lingered in the cool night air. Chris frowned, inspecting the scene further. Did someone come into the yard? He wondered aloud. He looked over his shoulder at the open door, now realizing what had happened. The creature, whatever it was, must have somehow managed to escape the basket during the night, leaving the back door wide open. Panic started to creep into his chest. Was it possible that the creature had somehow opened the door itself? He glanced back at the basket and noticed that it had been shifted slightly, evidence that the animal had made its escape. The thought of the little creature running wild in the yard was both frustrating and concerning. "Where did you go?" Chris muttered, trying to piece together the mystery. Chris felt torn. He couldn't just leave the creature outside unattended, especially after all it had been through. He'd promised to take care of it, and this unexpected escape only complicated things. But he couldn't just rush out into the dark yard without some sort of plan. He grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and cautiously stepped outside, scanning the backyard. The trash and the mess were clues, but they didn't offer much help in locating the creature. Chris called out softly, "Hey, little guy, where are you?" For a few moments, he heard nothing but the rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant sound of a car passing by on the road. Chris stood still, listening for any noise that might lead him to the animal. Then, as if on cue, he heard a soft squeak coming from the bushes near the fence. Chris rushed toward the sound, shining the flashlight in the direction of the noise. His heart pounded in his chest as the light caught the gleaming eyes of the creature, still small and vulnerable, now surrounded by a few bushes. "Found you." Chris breathed in relief, kneeling down to gently coax the animal back toward the house. It was hungry and scared, but there was something in its demeanor that made Chris believe it was still trusting him. Carefully, he lifted the creature, keeping it close to his chest. As he returned to the house, he couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of responsibility. What had started as a simple discovery in the woods had turned into an unexpected journey, one that was far from over. As Chris surveyed the mess, he heard more noises from downstairs. This time, he discovered his house in complete disarray. Junk was strewn everywhere, and his pantry had been completely raided. Torn food packages littered the living room and kitchen, with coffee grounds spilled across the floor, creating an odd, dark trail. But there was something new this time. A trail of brown footprints, coffee-stained prints running across the floor, leaving a stamp-like pattern throughout the house. Some of the prints led to the small sleeping area of his new bulb guest. "Did you really do this?" Chris muttered in disbelief. How could such an innocent-looking creature cause all this havoc? In the following weeks, Chris watched the small animal closely, his suspicions growing. Each night, he woke up to find a new mess, something knocked over, food scattered, or broken furniture. Every time, he meticulously documented the chaos. The little creature, once tiny enough to fit in the palm of his hand, had grown rapidly. Its size and weight had at least quadrupled, and the baldness it had when Chris found it was slowly disappearing. Dark fur began to grow in, soon covering most of her body. Despite the damage, a bond between Chris and the animal began to form. She became increasingly playful, and Chris couldn't help but grow fond of her. But there was one downside. She remained active at night. Every morning, Chris would find strange noises had woken him, and there were bite marks on the legs of furniture. Something had always been knocked over or broken. Chris discovered a tiny, bald creature in his yard, which he later identified as a Chinese naked wombat. Initially thinking it was just a curious pet, Chris found out that wombats are social creatures that don't travel alone. One night, Chris discovered 6 fully grown wombats in his living room, revealing that the family had followed the one he had rescued. After further investigation, Chris found a hole beneath the house where the wombat family had entered. Despite the chaos caused by the wombats, Chris knew he couldn't keep them as it was illegal to keep a wombat as a pet. He took the family to a wildlife sanctuary where they were safely released. The sanctuary owner offered Chris weekly visits to see his dear friend, the once bald wombat. Chris volunteered at the sanctuary, and though no longer living together, the bond between them remained strong, and Chris knew he had made the right decision.